Hi, my name is Mel Halkershoven and this is a video introduction to Hyper-V, which is a software product provided by Microsoft allowing you to virtualize operating systems. We will discuss briefly what virtualization is, how to configure Hyper-V virtual switches and virtual machines. This topic does assume that you have some prior experience with Windows, including installing and configuring Windows, the hardware components required by an operating system, and networking concepts such as IP addressing and subnetting. So what does virtualization mean? In this simple example, we have a computer system which includes the typical components such as a CPU, RAM, hard disk drive, video cards, and network cards. On this computer system, we install a single operating system, such as Windows, and the operating system communicates directly with the hardware. However, when we use virtualization software such as Hyper-V, we insert an extra layer which is called the hypervisor. The hypervisor allows us to install several operating systems that can run at the same time, and each operating system communicates with the hardware through the hypervisor. In this example, the physical computer system is called the host, and each operating system is referred to as the guest. While there are several different software products that we can use for virtualization, we're only going to focus on Hyper-V. Hyper-V is now available as a role in newer versions of Windows for free, including Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2, Windows 8 and 8.1 Pro, and Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. In these examples, I'm going to demonstrate just with Windows Server 2012 R2. When you install a virtual operating system, there's some hardware factors you need to consider. Each operating system will require allocated hard drive space, so you need to have enough disk space for the number of operating systems you wish to run. The number of operating systems running simultaneously is limited by the amount of memory you have. So I recommend you have at least 8 GB of memory to run a handful of virtual machines, but more is better. So your processor must also support virtualization, which most do these days. However, this is often disabled by default in the BIOS. If so, you will need to enable this. Each BIOS will look completely different and gives this setting a different name. But this picture here is just one example of where you can find the setting in the BIOS. When you're planning your hard disk space, decide whether you're going to use a fixed disk or a dynamic disk. A fixed disk will allocate all of the space up front. For example, if you create a 600 GB virtual disk, the entire disk space will be taken up on your actual disk, the entire 600 GB. Whereas if you use a dynamic disk, the virtual disk will only take up the space you've used. In this example, 100 GB has been used, so your virtual disk will only be 100 GB and will expand in size as you use up the space. In this demonstration today, I'm going to show you how you can start building your virtual environment from a network diagram. You should always do your planning first and then build your virtual environment from your diagrams. In this network diagram, I've connected the physical server, the host, to the physical network, which includes internet access. And then I will create a virtual switch, server, and workstation which are completely disconnected from the physical network. It is possible to connect your virtual computers or your virtual servers to your physical network, but I don't recommend it when you're just practicing and doing practicals and demonstrations. So let's go and install Hyper-V. This is what you get when you first install Windows Server 2012. This is what you get, the Server Manager dashboard. And to install Hyper-V as a role, we go up to Manage and Add Roles and Features. Note that if you're using Windows 8, this will be completely different. So we're just using showing how to install it in the server version. We're just going to skip past and use all the defaults through these initial screens. We've only got one server, so we're selecting the server that we're on. And here we have the roles, add roles and features wizard. So I'm going to select Hyper-V, and it's going to install some additional features which are required to make it work. And then we select next, and we're going to select all the other defaults. Okay, we can actually configure virtual switches here, but I want to show you how to do that later. And I'll click install. Now this install process is going to take a little while, and it will also require a reboot afterwards. So I'm going to pause this video and resume after the reboot. Okay, so I've finished installing the Hyper-V role, and this server has now restarted. And we're presented again with the server manager, and now you can see here that the Hyper-V role has appeared and has been installed. So to start managing Hyper-V virtual servers, we actually come up to the tools here and find Hyper-V Manager. Now again, this is going to be different in Windows 8 because the Hyper-V Manager is not going to show up. Well, there's no server manager that's going to show up at all in Windows 8. So you will find it through your program files. You'll go down here to the Start menu in Windows 8, scroll down and search for the software within the programs. Okay, so we've now got the Hyper-V Manager. I'm just going to expand this to full screen. So you'll see here, this is actually my host. The name of this server is called CSE. And we've got a few settings down here, and this is where my virtual machines will appear. And as you can see, I haven't got any yet. But the first thing I'm going to do is set up my virtual switch. So if you remember from my network diagram, I said I was going to keep my switch separate from the external network. So if we go to Virtual Switch Manager, okay, and I'm going to create a new switch. The options here are external, internal, and private. The external is the one that allows us to connect through our physical network card to the physical network, and that would give me internet access, so I don't want that one. Internal allows us to connect with the host machine, so we don't connect out to the internet, but we'll still be able to communicate with the host machine. And I'm not going to use this one either for now. I'm going to keep my virtual machines completely private, and they don't have anything to do with my host machine at all. So it's fairly simple. Create virtual switch. So I'm going to call this vSwitch. You can call it any name you want, really. It just needs to be descriptive, and it needs to match your network diagram. And apply, and that switch has been created, and it's applying the changes now. That's all I need to do. So that will actually now appear when I later create my virtual machines. I will be able to find that virtual switch and connect to it. So the next stage is to actually create my virtual machine. And here I can actually go right click on my host, click new, virtual machine. Now you see I have other options here as well. I can create hard disks, but I'm going to just create my new hard disk at the same time as the virtual machine. So new virtual machine, and it gives me a few options. I'm going to skip past this first option. And my first computer that I'm creating is called DC01. And it gives me the option to store my virtual machines in a different location. And this might be a good idea, but for this demonstration, I'm just going to keep the defaults. And I'm going to let Hyper-V choose where to install the virtual disks and the virtual machines. So I click Next. Now, Generation 1 and Generation 2. In simple terms, if you're installing older operating systems like Server 2008 or Windows 7, you're going to use Generation 1. If you're installing Windows Server 2012 or Windows 8, then you'll most likely use Generation 2. In most of our practicals, for starters, we're going to be using Windows Server 2008 R2, so I'm going to just stick with Generation 1 for now. Even though my host is 2012, that doesn't matter. I'm going to choose Generation 1 for my virtual machines and click Next. Okay, here we can choose startup memory. And I'm going to enable dynamic memory because this allows us to give our operating systems whatever memory that they can allocate. I'm going to let the Hyper-V manager or the Hyper-V server allocate memory according to its needs. And this doesn't affect my host operating system. For startup memory, I want to give it a little bit more because I think that the startup phase actually uses more memory than perhaps later. So we'll give it extra startup memory, and then we'll make a minimum of 512 meg later. And so we'll click next. Okay, remember that virtual switch we created earlier? Here's our chance to actually connect. So we've just plugged in a cable from our server into our virtual switch. Now here's the virtual hard disk. This is the hard disk that I was talking about earlier. You create this is called a VHDX file, and these hard disks are like ordinary disks as far as the server's concerned, but they're virtual. And for now, I'm only going to give 20 gig because my virtual machine for these purposes isn't going to need a lot of hard disk space. You have these other options. If you had an existing hard disk, you could connect one that you've already created, or you could attach one later if you're not sure what you're going to do. Okay, so for now, we'll just let Hyper-V create the hard disk. Here I also have the chance to install an operating system. So if I had an ISO file, I could actually select that now. I could do this by selecting this option. I could either have a disk in the drive and select the drive, or I can select my ISO file here. For now, I'm going to install an operating system later because this is just a demo. I'm just setting it up at this stage. You can also do a network boot here. Now keep in mind, when you earlier chose Generation 1 versus Generation 2, you need to carefully look at which option you choose because the network boot may not work. You need to select the right generation machine for this to work. Okay, and then I'm going to click next and we'll finish. So it's creating the virtual machine, creating the disks and all the hardware. Okay, so there's my virtual machine and it's off and it's actually got no operating system installed. If I actually now go and look at the settings, I'm going to look at the hardware of this machine. So I've got a BIOS. This is a virtual BIOS. I've got virtual memory. Now here you'll see that startup memory I selected, and then I chose dynamic memory. So that means once my server started up, it will scale down to 512 meg of RAM if it doesn't need it. And the maximum RAM, I'm just letting Hyper-V sort that out for me. I don't need to know what the maximum memory is. You can configure that if you want to make sure that it doesn't go above a certain amount of memory, but for our purposes that's not necessary. We have a processor, a virtual processor. You can allocate extra processors if you want to. Here's our hard disk we created earlier. We have a DVD drive, and what's important as well is the network adapter. We can actually create extra network adapters for our purposes if we need. We can create 2 separate networks, extra switches. This network, I've currently got one, and this network adapter is currently connected to the virtual switch I created earlier. If I want to add extra hardware, the only hardware that you're probably going to add would be extra hard drives or extra network adapters. And you can do this up here. So I can create a SCSI controller, an extra network adapter, and you just click add and go through the prompts. If I needed to, I could change the name of my virtual server here. Hopefully, if you've done your planning right, you wouldn't need to make any of these changes later. And those are mainly the settings that we would need to be concerned with. So I'm going to click OK and exit out of there. If I wanted to, I could actually create a checkpoint now. probably not much need because it's blank. I've got no server installed. It's just a blank hard disk, and they're really easy to create. So I'm not going to create a checkpoint, or there's no need to create a checkpoint. I will do one just as a demo. And now I've actually got a date that if I messed up my machine, I could actually revert to this state by clicking revert, or I could delete this checkpoint. To revert, I would come up here and click revert, and that would take me to the previous state. So this is really handy when practicing your practicals, to create checkpoints as you go along so that you can do a practical exercise, and if it doesn't go well, you can actually just revert to the previous state. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly create a second virtual machine to replicate the diagram that I created. So now I've got workstation 01. Okay, we're going to choose the defaults. Again, I'm going to stick with generation 1 because we're going to use Windows 7. Startup memory, I'm going to give it a little bit of extra startup memory. Use dynamic memory. Connecting it to my switch. Okay, using the defaults. I'm just going to scale down the hard disk size because that's a little bit too much. And I'm going to install an operating system later. There we go. All my settings, click finish. And it's done. If I want to connect to these, I can actually just double click on them and connect. And guess what? The virtual machine is off. If I click start, it's just going to tell me that there's, no operating system on there. And look at that, boot failure. That sums it up for this video. In a later video, I'm actually going to go ahead and install the operating systems and show you how you can connect an ISO file to your virtual machine and install like installing a regular operating system.